When people think about wartime food, they usually imagine canned rations, powdered eggs, or the standardized field kits issued by modern armies. Those items were important, but they only tell part of the story. Across Europe and Asia, millions of soldiers spent long stretches cut off from reliable supply chains. Railways were bombed, convoys were intercepted, and advancing armies frequently outran the logistics meant to sustain them. In those moments, survival stopped being an industrial problem and became a local one. Soldiers had to rely on whatever the land could provide, and in many places, a small, easily overlooked plant began to appear again and again, growing where bombs had fallen, where fields had been abandoned, and where trenches had torn the soil apart. It was not part of military rations, and it was rarely mentioned in official reports. But for soldiers dealing with shortages and nutritional fatigue, it quietly became more valuable than some of the vegetables armies tried to supply through formal logistics. That plant was purslane. When wartime supply systems failed, soldiers had to rediscover something earlier armies already understood. Before the 20th century, armies expected soldiers to supplement their rations by foraging or purchasing food locally. But by the time World War II began, military planners believed industrial food systems had solved that problem. Preserved rations were designed to keep soldiers fed anywhere in the world. The reality proved far more complicated. On the Eastern Front, German and Soviet forces operated across vast distances where transportation networks were fragile or destroyed. In the Pacific Theater, soldiers often found themselves stranded on islands where supply ships could not always reach them quickly. Even in Western Europe, fast-moving offensives sometimes pushed troops ahead of their own supply lines. When preserved rations ran low or became nutritionally inadequate over time, soldiers began paying closer attention to the landscape around them. Some relied on farms or local markets when possible, but in devastated regions where agriculture had collapsed, wild plants became an important fallback. Among the plants that repeatedly appeared in soldiers' accounts was a low-growing green that thrived in disturbed soil and harsh conditions. Purslane thrived exactly where war left its mark. Purslane is not an impressive-looking plant. It grows close to the ground with thick, reddish stems and small, rounded leaves, but it has several characteristics that made it ideal for survival conditions. First, it grows almost anywhere. Disturbed soil, exactly the kind created by trenches, shell craters, rubble fields and abandoned farmland, is where purslane spreads most easily. Where other crops struggled, this plant often flourished. Second, it grows quickly and requires almost no care. In warm conditions, it can spread across large patches of ground within just a few weeks. Soldiers digging defensive positions sometimes noticed it appearing along trench edges soon after the soil had been disturbed. Third, and most important, it is highly nutritious. For troops living on preserved foods for long periods, fresh nutrients mattered more than variety. Purslane provided vitamins and minerals that were often missing from standard rations. What soldiers discovered through necessity turned out to be surprisingly valuable nutritionally. Modern analysis shows that purslane contains unusually high levels of omega-3 fatty acids for a leafy plant. These fats are more commonly associated with fish, yet they play an important role in maintaining cardiovascular health and supporting brain function. The plant also contains strong levels of vitamin C, vitamin A, magnesium, potassium, and antioxidants. For soldiers suffering from fatigue, minor nutrient deficiencies, or the monotony of preserved rations, adding even small amounts of fresh greens could make a meaningful difference. Compared to common garden vegetables like tomatoes or lettuce, purslane often contains higher concentrations of several of these nutrients. This was not something soldiers knew scientifically during the war, but, through experience, many discovered that Adding wild greens like purslane to soups or even eating them raw really helped maintain energy and reduce some of the physical strain that came with long periods of limited diets. Across parts of the Mediterranean, local civilians already treated purslane as a normal food. Soldiers stationed in places like Greece, Italy, and Turkey often learned about it directly from the people living there. In regions where traditional food knowledge remained strong, the plant was never considered unusual at all. After the war, the same plant that had quietly helped sustain soldiers began to disappear from everyday awareness. The end of World War II brought a massive shift toward industrial agriculture in much of the world. Governments focused on maximizing crop yields, standardizing food production, and expanding large-scale farming systems. In that environment, plants that grew outside controlled fields were increasingly labeled as weeds. Purslane became one of them. Because it grows aggressively in cultivated soil, farmers began treating it as an unwanted competitor to commercial crops. Agricultural guides recommended removing it and, herbicides were developed specifically to eliminate plants like it from fields and gardens. Over time, this classification changed public perception. Instead of being seen as a useful edible plant, purslane became something people were encouraged to pull out and discard. Within a few generations, many people in industrialized countries no longer recognized it as food at all. The fading of this knowledge really reflects how quickly survival skills can disappear in stable societies. The soldiers who relied on wild plants during World War II were not practicing a new form of survival. They were rediscovering something that had once been common knowledge. For most of human history, people understood the edible plants growing around them. Wars, famines, and natural disasters made that knowledge essential. But modern food systems changed that relationship. Supermarkets, replaced our seasonal awareness of the landscape. Industrial agriculture reduced the variety of plants people encountered in daily life. As a result, small pieces of practical knowledge, like recognizing a resilient, nutrient-rich plant growing in disturbed soil, gradually faded from public memory. Yet the conditions that forced soldiers to rediscover these plants during wartime were not unique to the 1940s. Supply disruptions, disasters, and conflict can still interrupt modern food systems. When that happens, understanding the environment around us becomes valuable again. Remembering these overlooked details helps us see war and survival more clearly. World War II is often remembered through large-scale operations and technological innovation, but at the level of individual soldiers, survival frequently depended on simple adaptations, finding clean water, preserving energy, and sometimes recognizing which plants could safely be eaten. Purslane is a small example of that reality. It did not win battles or change military strategy, but in quiet, practical ways, it helped sustain soldiers in places where supply systems broke down. Those stories rarely appear in official war histories, yet they reveal something important about human resilience. Survival often depends less on dramatic solutions and more on careful observation, local knowledge, and the ability to adapt to difficult conditions. And sometimes it depends on noticing the small things growing right under our feet. If you value these deeper historical stories and the lessons they offer about survival and preparedness, consider subscribing to Logistics of Survival and share this video with others who appreciate thoughtful, in-depth history.